Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is deciding whether or not to say something. Maybe it's a journalist in a country where the wrong headline ends careers or lives. Maybe it's an employee who knows something damaging about their boss. Maybe it's just you, pausing before you send a message, your thumb hovering over the screen, wondering what happens if you do. That hesitation, that split second between the thought and the word, is one of the oldest experiences in human history. People have felt it in the marketplaces of ancient Babylon, in the shadow of the Egyptian pharaoh, in the back rows of Athenian courtrooms, and in the prison cells where some of the most important minds who ever lived spent their final days. The right to say what you think is so familiar to us now that we treat it like oxygen, invisible, assumed, unremarkable. But it was not given to us. It was fought for, bled for, and burned for across 4,000 years of human civilization by prophets and philosophers and poets and printers who refused, against all rational self-interest, to simply shut up. This is their story, and before it's over, you may never think about your own silence or your own voice quite the same way again. This moment of hesitation, this breath drawn before the thought becomes sound, is the central tension of civilization. It is the story of free speech. We tend to think of free speech as a dusty legal clause in a modern constitution, something for lawyers and journalists to squabble over. But the history of speaking freely is not a history of paper. It is a history of trembling hands, of whispered secrets in the back of a tavern, of ink hidden under floorboards, and of the sheer, stubborn human refusal to shut up. It is a story that begins not in the halls of modern parliaments, but in the mud, the dust, and the fire of the ancient world. To understand why we can say what we think today, and why that right is so fragile, we must go very far back, to a time when speaking against the current was not just a crime, but an offense against the structure of the universe itself. We begin our journey in the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, roughly 4,000 years ago. It is tempting to look at the Code of Hammurabi, that towering basalt stele covered in cuneiform, as the first law book. But it is also the first comprehensive list of things you were not allowed to say. Freedom in Babylon was not an individual right. It was a function of order. The king was the shepherd, the people were the flock, and speech was a tool of administration. The prologue to the code itself declares that Hammurabi was sent by the gods to make justice visible in the land, to destroy the wicked person and the evildoer, that the strong might not injure the weak. This was a world where speech had tangible, almost magical weight. A curse uttered in the name of a god was believed to activate real forces in the world. To swear a false oath in a business transaction was not merely fraud, it was an invitation for the god Shamash, the divine judge, to strike down your household. Consider the specific laws governing the tongue. Law 127 of Hammurabi's Code states that if a man points a finger at a priestess or a married woman and accuses her of impropriety without proof, they shall flog that man before the judges, and they shall shave off half of his hair. This is a fascinating punishment. It is not lethal, but it is public and deeply shaming. In a society where honor and reputation were currency, to be half-bald was to walk through the marketplace with a scarlet letter carved into your scalp. It was a visible warning to everyone. This man's words are poison. This man's tongue is loose. Even more severe was Law 11, which dealt with false accusation of sorcery. Sorcery was the ultimate crime of speech, using words and rituals to harm others from a distance. If you accused someone of being a witch and could not prove it, you were put to death. The logic was cold but clear. A false accusation of forbidden speech was itself a form of forbidden speech. The community could not tolerate the chaos of baseless charges flying back and forth. To speak falsely about the supernatural was to tamper with the very fabric of reality. There is a remarkable document from the city of Mari, dating to around 1770 BCE, that gives us a glimpse of how this played out in daily life. It is a letter from a provincial governor named Kibri Dagan to his king, Zimri Lim. Kibri Dagan reports that a prophet has arisen in the temple of the god Dagan. This prophet, in a trance state, began to speak in the voice of the god, criticizing the king for not sending enough offerings to the temple. The prophet said, "I am the one who made you king, and I can unmake you." A man stands up in a sacred space and publicly declares that the king's legitimacy is conditional and revocable. In almost any other ancient context, this man would have been executed before sunset. But the governor of Marie does not ask for permission to arrest the prophet. He writes to the king to ask for clarification. He asks, "Should I send this man to you so you may hear his words directly, or should I just report them?" The king, astonishingly, requests a lock of the prophet's hair and the fringe of his garment, physical tokens to be used in divination rituals to verify the authenticity of the prophecy. The prophet is not punished. He is treated as a potential channel of divine communication, even when that communication is critical of the crown. This tells us something crucial. In Mesopotamia, the boundary between free speech and blasphemy was porous because the boundary between the human voice and the divine voice was porous. If a god wanted to criticize the king through a human mouth, no mortal could stand in the way. But if a mortal wanted to criticize the king through his own mouth, he was a dead man. The distinction was not about the content of the words, it was about the perceived source of the words. This is a theme that will echo across millennia. Who is authorized to speak dangerous truths? The prophet or the citizen? The oracle or the ordinary person? A few centuries later and a few hundred miles southwest, we find a more nuanced yet equally rigid system in the land of the pharaohs. Egyptian wisdom literature, the manuals for how a young scribe should live, is filled with the admonition to guard your tongue. The instruction of Ptahhotep, one of the oldest books in existence, advises the reader to be silent in the presence of superiors. Do not repeat a word of slander, it warns, for it is the food of the contentious spirit. The text goes further, offering a psychological insight that remains piercingly relevant. If you are a man of authority, be patient when you listen to the words of a petitioner. Do not dismiss him until he has unburdened himself of what he planned to say. A petitioner likes attention to his words more than the granting of his request. This is a stunning recognition. Even in a rigidly hierarchical society, the act of being heard is a fundamental human need. The Egyptian bureaucracy understood that if you do not let people speak, if you cut them off mid-sentence, you are not just being rude, you are denying them a piece of their humanity. And yet, this same bureaucracy was merciless towards speech that challenged the state's theological foundations. The Egyptian state was a theological machine. The pharaoh was a god walking the earth, the living embodiment of Horus, the son of Osiris. His word was the law. The concept of Mayat, often translated as truth, justice, order, and cosmic harmony, governed everything. To speak against the pharaoh's works or his name was not treason in the modern sense. It was a kind of spiritual static, a glitch in the reality that the gods had set in motion. It was an assault on Ma'at itself. We have records of the trial of courtiers who plotted against Rameses III, known as the Harem Conspiracy. The scribes of the court did not write down the exact words of the conspirators. To write the seditious words down was to give them a second life, to preserve them for eternity, which was the opposite of what the state wanted. Instead, the judicial papyrus refers to the conspirators by pseudonyms designed to destroy their identities. One man is renamed Re Hates Him. Another is called Evil Beast. A woman involved in the plot is named She Whose Eyes Are Flickering, implying she is a seductive, destabilizing force. By renaming them in the official record, the state was performing a magical act of erasure. The ultimate punishment for speech in Egypt was not just death, but the erasure of the name from the tomb walls and the papyri. To have no mouth and no memory was the truest form of silence. It was a second death, the death of being forgotten. But the story of free speech is not just about the suppression of the individual. It is also about the first, tentative, glorious moments when the crowd did gather to listen instead of attack. For that, we must sail to a rocky peninsula jutting into the Aegean Sea, ancient Greece, and we must be careful here. The popular image of Athens is of white-bearded philosophers debating freely in the Agora, the birthplace of the West's love affair with the open mind. That image is both true and a lie. The Greek contribution was not the invention of free speech, but the invention of a specific kind of protected, rowdy, and dangerous public debate called isagoria, the equal right of all citizens to address the assembly. This was a thunderclap in human history. In Sparta, a man spoke only when spoken to. In Persia, you prostrated yourself before the great king and spoke only in formulas of submission. But in Athens, the herald would open the meeting of the ecclesia, the popular assembly, with the words, "Who wishes to speak?" A common farmer, a potter, a fisherman could stand up next to Pericles, the great general and aristocrat, and call him a fool. He could propose a law. He could demand an audit of public funds. He could argue for war or peace. This was the radical innovation. The right to speak was not tied to wealth, birth, or military rank. It was tied solely to citizenship. But let us be clear about the limits. This right was for citizens only, a tiny minority of the population that excluded women, enslaved people, and resident foreigners known as metics. Aristotle, the great philosopher and tutor of Alexander the Great, justified the exclusion of women from public speech on the grounds that they were naturally unsuited for it. In his Politics, he writes that the male is by nature superior and the female inferior. The one rules, and the other is ruled. This was not a fringe view, it was the unquestioned consensus. The voice of women in the public sphere was considered not just improper, but dangerous. In tragedy, however, we find a fascinating counter-narrative. The playwright Sophocles, in his play Antigone, presents a young woman who defies the king's edict and speaks truth to power. When Creon forbids the burial of her brother Polynices, Antigone does not remain silent. She says, "I did not think your edicts strong enough to overrule the unwritten, unalterable laws of God and heaven." She speaks, she is condemned, and she dies. But her voice, through the medium of theater, echoes through the ages. The Athenians allowed their playwrights to explore the consequences of silencing dissent, even as they silenced women in their own political life. The theater became a kind of licensed zone for dangerous speech, a pressure release valve where the city could confront its own anxieties about power and justice. More importantly, Athens was terrified of the power of speech to offend the gods. The crime was asabeia, impiety. And it was under this charge that the most famous voice of ancient Greece, Socrates, was silenced. But Socrates was not the first, nor the last, victim of Athenian anxiety about dangerous ideas. Before him, there was Anaxagoras, a philosopher who taught that the sun was not a god, but a giant fiery rock larger than the Peloponnese. For this astronomical and theological heresy, he was prosecuted for impiety and forced to flee Athens, spending his final years in exile. There was Protagoras, the great sophist, who opened his book on the gods with the line, "Concerning the gods, I am unable to know whether they exist or do not exist, or what they are like in form." For this agnosticism, he was charged with impiety. His books were burned in the Agora, one of the earliest recorded instances of mass book burning in history, and he fled Athens, reportedly drowning in a shipwreck during his escape. There was Diagoras of Melos, known as the Atheist, who was condemned to death for revealing the secrets of the Eleusinian mysteries and mocking the gods. A bounty was placed on his head, and he spent the rest of his life as a fugitive. These cases demonstrate that the Athenian commitment to free inquiry was always conditional. The city loved debate, but it drew a bright red line at the gods who protected the city. To question the existence of Athena was not seen as an intellectual exercise. It was seen as an act of civic sabotage, an invitation for the goddess to withdraw her favor and let the Spartans through the gates. The story of Socrates in 399 BCE is the foundational trauma of the Western free speech tradition. He was 70 years old, a stonemason by trade, and a conversational grenade by disposition. He did not write books. He just asked questions. What is justice? What is courage? Why do you, a famous general, know nothing about war? This method, which we now call the Socratic method and teach in law schools as the pinnacle of reasoned inquiry, was seen by many Athenians as corrosive poison. He was charged with corrupting the youth and inventing new gods. The formal charges, preserved in the records of the trial, were specific. Socrates is guilty of not believing in the gods the city believes in, and of introducing other new divinities. He is also guilty of corrupting the young. The penalty demanded is death. In his defense, as recorded by Plato in the Apology, Socrates makes one of the most radical claims in the history of thought. He tells the jury of 500 men that he would rather die than stop asking questions. He likens his role to that of a gadfly pestering a sluggish horse, Athens itself, into wakefulness. The unexamined life, he famously said, is not worth living. But he goes further. When the jury raised the possibility of acquittal contingent on his silence, he rejected the offer outright. Men of Athens, he says, I honor and love you, but I shall obey the god rather than you. And while I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy. This is not a man begging for his life. This is a man asserting a higher allegiance than the state. He is claiming that his conscience and his duty to truth supersede the laws of Athens. The jury, already stung by his refusal to grovel, did not appreciate the metaphor. They voted to kill him by a margin of roughly 280 to 220. He drank the hemlock. And in that moment, the paradox of free speech was born. Athens, the city of the open forum, killed the man who only wanted to talk. The lesson was stark. A society can love debate in theory, but hate the individual who actually wields it. A society can value the idea of free speech, but recoil at the practice of it. The backlash against Socrates was not immediate. In the decades after his death, Athens seemed to recognize that it had committed a terrible error. The charges against his accusers were dropped, and Socrates became a kind of secular saint. But the damage was done. The execution of Socrates cast a long shadow over Plato, his most famous student. Plato's entire philosophical project can be read as a response to the trauma of seeing his teacher killed by democracy. In the Republic, Plato constructs an ideal city where philosophers rule as kings and poets are exiled. He argues that the masses cannot be trusted with unfettered speech because they are too easily swayed by rhetoric and emotion. He had seen the demagogues whip the assembly into a frenzy. He had seen the jury of common men condemn the wisest man in Athens. And so, the father of Western philosophy, the student of the martyr for free inquiry, became one of the earliest and most profound advocates for censorship. He argued that the state should control the stories told to children, the music played in public, and the ideas circulating in the marketplace. This is the deep irony at the heart of our story. The man who gave us the written memory of Socrates' defense of free speech also gave us the blueprint for the totalitarian state that silences all dissent. As the Roman Republic rose to swallow the Greek world, they inherited this tension. The Romans were less interested in philosophical truth and more interested in politics and reputation. They had a concept called fama, public opinion, and reputation. They also had a very specific understanding of slander and libel. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest law code, allegedly prescribed the death penalty for anyone who chanted an evil song or composed a poem that caused another person shame. Speech was a weapon of the arena. In the Roman Forum, men like Cicero wielded rhetoric like a sword. He exposed a conspiracy by a senator named Catiline in a series of speeches that are still taught as masterpieces of persuasion. "How long, O Catiline, will you abuse our patience?" Cicero roared. He was using speech to save the state from a secret plot. But let us look more closely at Cicero's career, for it is a masterclass in the power and peril of free speech in a republic in decline. Cicero belonged to no ancient senatorial dynasty. As a novus homo, a new man, he was the first of his line ever to hold the consulship. His only weapon was his voice. He had no army, no vast inherited wealth, no network of aristocratic clients. He had only his ability to stand in the forum and convince the Roman people and the Senate to follow his lead. In the year 63 BCE, he used that voice to uncover and crush the Catilinarian conspiracy. In 4 speeches, delivered over the course of a few weeks, he laid out the evidence, named the conspirators, and convinced the Senate to execute them without trial. He was hailed as Pater Patriae, the father of the fatherland. His words had saved the Republic, but the same voice that saved him also doomed him. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and marched on Rome, Cicero was torn. He admired Caesar's brilliance, but feared his ambition. He wrote letters to his friend Atticus, agonizing over what to say and what to do. "I am ashamed of my indecision," he wrote. "I see what is right, but I cannot bring myself to say it openly." This is the voice of a man who understands the power of speech, but also the price of it. During Caesar's dictatorship, Cicero largely withdrew from public life, devoting himself to writing philosophical works. It was a form of internal exile, a self-imposed silence. When Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, Cicero saw his chance to restore the Republic. He returned to the Senate and delivered a series of 14 speeches against Mark Antony, Caesar's ambitious lieutenant. These speeches, known as the Philippics, are among the most devastating political attacks ever written. He called Antony a drunkard, a gladiator, a monster, a public enemy. He mocked Antony's personal habits, his sexual exploits, his financial corruption. He said of Antony, "You have no nose for the stench of your own crimes." He said, "The life you lead, the words you speak, the company you keep, all proclaim you an enemy of the state." He did not mince words. He did not seek compromise. He used every rhetorical weapon in his arsenal to destroy Antony's reputation and rally the Senate against him. He succeeded in the short term. The Senate declared Antony a public enemy, but Cicero had made a fatal miscalculation. He had aligned himself with Octavian, Caesar's young adopted heir, believing he could control him. Octavian, however, made a deal with Antony and another general named Lepidus. They formed the second triumvirate, dividing the Roman world among themselves, and they drew up proscription lists, lists of their political enemies who were to be killed without trial. Antony insisted that Cicero's name be at the top of the list. Octavian, after some hesitation, agreed. Cicero tried to flee. He made it to the coast, but bad weather and seasickness forced him to turn back. The assassins caught up with him at his villa near Formiae. According to the historian Plutarch, Cicero's slaves prepared to defend him, but Cicero ordered them to set down his litter and accept his fate. He leaned out and offered his neck to the sword. He was beheaded. His head and his hands, the parts that wrote the Philippics and gestured in the Forum, were brought back to Rome. Antony's wife Fulvia is said to have seized Cicero's severed head and, in an act of personal vengeance, driven a hairpin through his tongue again and again. Then the head and hands were nailed to the rostra, the very platform in the Forum where Cicero had held the crowd in his thrall, where he had thundered against Catiline, where he had denounced Antony. The message was as clear as it was brutal. This is what happens to the voice that speaks too loudly. This is the price of free speech in a world ruled by swords, not laws. The Romans understood the power of the voice so intimately that they knew the only way to truly kill an idea was to destroy the mouth and the hand that shaped it. And yet, the words of Cicero survived. His letters, his speeches, his philosophical dialogues were copied and preserved. For centuries, they were the model of Latin prose and republican virtue. Antony won the battle, but Cicero won the war for memory. This is the other lesson of the story. You can kill the speaker, but the speech, if it is powerful enough, and if there are people willing to preserve it, can live forever. Then came a shift in the tectonic plates of human society. The ancient world gave way to the medieval world, and the conversation about speech moved from the city square to the cathedral and the monastery. In the European Middle Ages, the question changed. It was no longer, "Can I speak against the king?" It became, "Can I speak against God?" The answer, organized by the Church, was almost always a terrifying no. This is the era of the Inquisition and the charge of heresy. It is a long and painful chapter in the history of silencing, but it is also the chapter where the idea of conscience begins to sharpen like a knife. The early Church was itself a community of dissenters, a persecuted minority within the Roman Empire. The first Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed for refusing to burn incense to the emperor. Their crime was speech, the confession that Jesus is Lord. This act of speaking the name of Christ was, in the eyes of the Roman state, an act of treason, a refusal to acknowledge the divinity of the emperor. The blood of the martyrs was the seed of the Church. But when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Theodosius I in 380 CE, the dynamic shifted dramatically. The persecuted became the persecutors. The voice that had cried out in the catacombs now sat on the throne. And it did not take long for the Church to begin using the power of the state to silence its own internal dissenters. The first major heresy to be suppressed by imperial force was Arianism, a theological dispute over the nature of Christ. Arius, a priest in Alexandria, taught that Christ was a created being, subordinate to God the Father. His opponent, Athanasius, argued that Christ was co-eternal and consubstantial with the Father. This might seem like an abstract theological squabble, but it was a question that touched the very foundations of Christian worship and identity. The dispute raged for decades, filling the streets of Alexandria and Constantinople with riots. The Emperor Constantine, desperate for unity, called the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. The council condemned Arius and his teachings. The Nicene Creed, which millions of Christians recite every Sunday, was formulated specifically to exclude Arian beliefs. Begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. These words were weapons in a war of ideas. Arius was exiled. His books were ordered to be burned. Possession of Arian writings became a crime. Constantine issued an edict that declared Arius a Porphyrian, a term of abuse derived from the pagan philosopher Porphyry, whose anti-Christian writings had been condemned. The edict stated that anyone who concealed a book by Arius would be put to death. This is the beginning of a long, dark tradition in Christian Europe, the burning of heretical books and the silencing of heretical voices. The Index of Forbidden Books, which would persist in the Catholic Church until 1966, has its roots in this moment. Consider the Waldensians, a group of laypeople in the 12th century who simply wanted to read the Bible in their own language. Their founder, Peter Waldo, had been a prosperous lion merchant before renouncing his wealth and taking up itinerant preaching modeled on apostolic simplicity. He funded a vernacular rendering of the Gospels, one of the earliest in Old French, so laypeople could engage with Scripture directly. The Church forbade it. The Third Lateran Council in 1179 declared that preaching without the authorization of the local bishop was forbidden. Waldo and his followers refused to stop. They argued that they must obey God rather than men, echoing the words of Peter and the apostles in the book of Acts. They were declared heretics and hunted for centuries. In 1211, a group of Waldensians was burned at the stake in Strasbourg. A chronicler records that they went to their deaths singing hymns and praying aloud. Their crime was speech, reading the Bible, preaching the gospel, and refusing to submit their voices to the authority of the church hierarchy. Or consider John Wycliffe in the 14th century, an Oxford professor who argued that the Bible, not the Pope, was the highest authority. He was a brilliant philosopher and theologian, known as the Flowering Doctor, for the beauty of his Latin prose. But he was also a relentless critic of the wealth and corruption of the Church. He argued that the Pope was the Antichrist, that the monastic orders were dens of vice, and that the doctrine of transubstantiation, the belief that the bread and wine of the Eucharist become the literal body and blood of Christ, was a recent invention with no basis in Scripture. He translated the Latin Vulgate into English so that even the boy who drives the plow could know Scripture. His followers, known as Lollards, traveled the English countryside, reading the Bible aloud to anyone who would listen. The Church struck back. In 1382, the Archbishop of Canterbury convened a council at Blackfriars in London and condemned 24 of Wycliffe's propositions as heretical. Wycliffe was forced to leave Oxford and retire to his parish in Lutterworth. He died of a stroke in 1384. But the Church was so infuriated by his words that 40 years later, at the Council of Constance in 1415, they formally condemned him as a heretic. They ordered that his remains be exhumed and burned. In 1428, on the orders of Pope Martin V, Wycliffe's bones were dug up, burned, and the ashes thrown into the river Swift. The river carried his ashes to the Avon to the Severn to the sea, and the sea to the whole world. As the Protestant historian Thomas Fuller later wrote, "Thus this brook hath conveyed his ashes into the Avon into the Severn into the narrow seas, they into the main ocean. And thus the ashes of Wycliffe are the emblem of his doctrine, which now is dispersed all the world over." Why dig up a dead man? Because words don't die when the speaker does. The authorities of the medieval world knew this. They burned books with the same fervor they burned bodies. Yet, in the margins of these manuscripts, in the secret meetings of the Lollards and the Hussites, a new idea was hardening in the human psyche. I have a duty to speak what I know to be true, regardless of the cost to my body. This is the birth of the modern concept of conscience as a higher authority than the state or the church. It is an idea that would take centuries to fully articulate, but its roots are here, in the ashes of Wycliffe and the flames that consumed the Waldensians. One more figure from this period demands our attention: Jan Hus, the Czech reformer. Hus was a priest and professor at the University of Prague in the early 15th century. He was deeply influenced by the writings of Wycliffe, which had been smuggled into Bohemia by students who had studied at Oxford. Hus began preaching in the Czech language at the Bethlehem Chapel in Prague. He criticized the sale of indulgences, the corruption of the clergy, and the authority of the Pope. He argued that the true head of the Church is Christ, not the Pope. He insisted that the Bible should be available in the language of the people. His sermons drew huge crowds. He became a national hero. In 1414, Hus was summoned to the Council of Constance to defend his views. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund promised him safe conduct, a guarantee that he could travel to the council and return home safely, regardless of the outcome. Hus accepted. He arrived in Constance in November 1414. Within weeks he was arrested and thrown into a dungeon. The council revoked his safe conduct on the grounds that promises made to a heretic are not binding. For months, Hus was kept in a cold, damp cell, suffering from illness and malnutrition. He was repeatedly interrogated. He was ordered to recant his teachings. He refused, unless his teachings could be proven false by Scripture and sound reason. On July 6, 1415, Jan Hus was led to the stake in a meadow outside the walls of Constance. He was stripped of his priestly vestments. A paper crown painted with devils was placed on his head. As the fire was lit, Hus began to sing a hymn: "Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me." The wind blew the flames into his face, and his voice was silenced. But like Wycliffe, his ashes were gathered and thrown into the Rhine River, and like Wycliffe, his death did not end his influence. The Hussite Wars, a series of bloody conflicts that lasted for decades, broke out in Bohemia shortly after his execution. The Czech people, outraged by the betrayal of Hus, rose up against the Holy Roman Empire and the Church. The cry of the Hussite armies was, "Truth will prevail," a phrase that would later be adopted as the national motto of Czechoslovakia. Jan Hus became a symbol of the nation's struggle for religious and political freedom. A century later, Martin Luther would declare, "We are all Hussites without knowing it." This idea, that conscience must be obeyed even at the cost of life, exploded into the open with the clatter of a printing press and the hammering of a monk's nail on a church door in Wittenberg in 1517. Martin Luther didn't intend to start a revolution. He intended to start a debate. His 95 Theses were an academic complaint about the sale of indulgences, basically paying the church to get time off in purgatory. The specific trigger was the campaign of a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel, who was selling indulgences in Germany to raise money for the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Tetzel's sales pitch was crude and effective. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Luther was outraged. He believed that this was a perversion of the gospel, a cheapening of grace, and an exploitation of the fears of ordinary Christians. On October 31st, 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. This was not a dramatic act of defiance. It was the normal way of announcing an academic disputation. The door of the church served as the university bulletin board, but thanks to Gutenberg's machine, those theses were copied, translated, and scattered across Germany within weeks. Luther had not sent them to a printer. Someone else, perhaps a student or a colleague, had taken them, translated them from Latin into German, and printed them without his permission. Within 2 months, they were being read in every corner of the German-speaking world. Within a year, Luther was the most famous man in Europe. The church demanded that he recant. Luther refused. In 1521, he was summoned to the Diet of Worms, an imperial assembly presided over by the young Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Luther was ordered to appear and answer for his writings. His friends urged him not to go, warning him of the fate of Jan Hus. Luther replied, "I will go to Worms, though there were as many devils as tiles on the roofs." He traveled through Germany like a conquering hero, greeted by cheering crowds in every town. At the Diet of Worms, Luther stood before the assembled princes, bishops, and the emperor himself. A pile of his books was placed on a table. He was asked 2 questions. "Are these your books, and will you recant them?" Luther asked for a day to consider his answer. The next day, he returned to the assembly and gave his response. He acknowledged the books as his own. He offered to recant anything that could be shown to contradict Scripture. But then he delivered the words that would echo through the centuries. "Unless I am convinced by the testimony of the Scriptures, or by clear reason, for I do not trust the Pope or councils alone, since it is clear that they have often erred and contradicted themselves, I am bound by the Scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the Word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. Amen." There is some historical debate about whether Luther actually said the famous words, "Here I stand." They do not appear in the earliest printed accounts of the speech, but they capture the essence of his position with such force and clarity that they have become inseparable from his legacy. The principle he articulated was revolutionary. The individual conscience, informed by Scripture and reason, stands in judgment over all human authority. The Pope may be wrong, the Emperor may be wrong, the councils of the Church may be wrong, but the conscience, when it is bound to the truth of God, cannot be wrong. This is a seminal moment. It is not a democratic claim for everyone's right to speak. Luther was just as intolerant of other dissenters as the Pope was of him. He wrote viciously against the peasants who rose up in the Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525, urging the princes to smite, slay, and stab them without mercy. He wrote appalling treatises against the Jews, advocating for the burning of their synagogues and the confiscation of their books. He had no interest in religious pluralism or tolerance. He believed that he had discovered the truth, and that all who disagreed with him were instruments of Satan. And yet, his stand at Worms established the principle of the individual standing against the monolithic institution based on the conviction of their own reading and reason. The Protestant Reformation was a bloodbath of speech, both the suppression of it and the proliferation of it. The printing press ensured that for every heretic burned at the stake, 1,000 pamphlets explaining why he was burned were circulating in the next town. The Reformation unleashed a century and a half of religious warfare across Europe. Catholics burned Protestants, Protestants burned Catholics. Anabaptists, who believed in adult baptism and the separation of church and state, were drowned by both sides. The wars of religion in France, the 30 Years' War in Germany, the English Civil War, all were fueled by the question of who had the right to define religious truth and who had the right to speak it. Europe was soaked in blood, exhausted by the question of who decides what God wants. Out of this exhaustion, a new conversation began. It was a conversation about tolerance, and it was led not by firebrands, but by quiet, often exiled writers. John Milton, the great English poet, wrote the Areopagitica in 1644. This is one of the most beautiful and essential documents in the English language on the subject of speech. He was arguing against a licensing law that required all books to be approved by a government censor before publication. The licensing order of 1643 had been passed by the Long Parliament, the same parliament that had risen up against King Charles I. Milton, who had been a passionate advocate for the parliamentary cause, was horrified that the new government was adopting the same methods of censorship that the old monarchy had used. He wrote the Areopagitica as a direct address to Parliament, invoking the memory of the ancient Athenian court of the Areopagus as a model of wise and deliberative judgment. Milton's argument is a piece of elegant genius. He does not argue for free speech because everyone has a right to be a fool. He argues for it because truth is strong. "Let truth and falsehood grapple," he wrote. Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter? He believed that if you cut off a bad idea, you can't refute it. It just festers underground. But if you drag the bad idea into the sunlight, truth will eventually wrestle it to the ground and win. It is an optimistic view of human reason, and it laid the groundwork for the Enlightenment. But Milton's argument is more nuanced than a simple demand for unlimited freedom. He did not believe that all speech should be protected. He explicitly excluded Catholic writings from his vision of tolerance because he saw Catholicism as a political threat, a foreign power that sought to undermine English sovereignty. He also believed that books that were found to be blasphemous or libelous should be subject to punishment after publication, not before. This distinction between prior restraint and subsequent punishment is a cornerstone of modern free speech law. Milton argued that it is better to allow a book to be published and then, if it is truly harmful, to punish the author and burn the book. The great evil, in his view, was the pre-publication censor, the official who decides what you are allowed to read before you have a chance to judge it for yourself. A few decades later, the philosopher John Locke, writing in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, made the case for toleration in his letter concerning toleration. Locke had lived through the turmoil of the English Civil War, the execution of Charles I, the dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell, the restoration of the monarchy, and the final expulsion of James II. He had seen firsthand the destruction that religious conflict could wreak. His letter, published in 1689, argued for a strict separation between the business of the state and the business of the soul. The state, Locke argued, exists to protect life, liberty, and property. It uses force to achieve these ends. But belief cannot be compelled by force. You cannot threaten a man with a sword and make him believe in the Trinity. You can make him say the words, but you cannot change his mind. Therefore, the state has no business enforcing religious orthodoxy. Locke famously excluded atheists and Catholics from his vision of tolerance, a reminder that even the most liberal minds have blind spots. He excluded atheists because he believed that oaths, promises, and contracts were the foundation of civil society, and that an atheist who did not fear divine punishment could not be trusted to keep his word. He excluded Catholics because he saw them as owing allegiance to a foreign prince, the Pope, and therefore as a potential fifth column. These exclusions are jarring to modern sensibilities, but they are a crucial reminder that the road to universal tolerance has been long, uneven, and marked by retreats as well as advances. The core of Locke's argument, however, was that the state cannot see into the soul. You cannot compel belief with a sword or a jail cell. Belief must be free because the mind is free. These were the ideas swirling in the air when a group of men in powdered wigs sat down in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to write a constitution. But they were nervous. They had just fought a war against a king. They knew how easily a government could silence its critics. They remembered the general warrants and the seditious libel prosecutions of the colonial era. They remembered the case of John Peter Zenger, a printer in New York who had been arrested in 1734 for publishing criticisms of the royal governor, William Cosby. Zenger's lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, had argued that truth should be a defense against libel, a radical idea at the time. The jury acquitted Zenger, and his case became a rallying cry for colonial liberty. When the framers of the Constitution proposed the Bill of Rights, they didn't put free speech first because it was the least important. They put it first because they believed it was the mechanism that protected everything else. The First Amendment reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." Notice the verbs, make no law. It is a negative command, a restraint on government power. It does not grant a right. It recognizes a pre-existing right and forbids the government from infringing upon it. Without free speech, you cannot have a free press to expose corruption. Without free speech, you cannot peaceably assemble to protest. Without free speech, you cannot petition the government for a redress of grievances. The First Amendment is the engine of the American experiment. But the ink on that parchment was barely dry before the country began to argue about what those words actually meant. Just 7 years after the First Amendment was ratified, President John Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. These laws, passed by a Federalist-controlled Congress, made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government, the President, or Congress. The Federalists, led by Adams and Alexander Hamilton, were terrified by the French Revolution and the rise of the Democratic-Republican opposition led by Thomas Jefferson. They saw Jefferson's supporters as Jacobins, agents of French radicalism who sought to overthrow the American government. The Sedition Act was designed to silence them, and it was used. More than 20 newspaper editors were arrested under the Sedition Act. Matthew Lyon, a congressman from Vermont, was convicted for writing a letter to the editor criticizing President Adams' unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice. He was sentenced to 4 months in jail and a fine of $1,000. He ran for re-election from his jail cell and won. Benjamin Franklin Bach, the grandson of Benjamin Franklin and the editor of the Philadelphia Aurora, was arrested for publishing a letter from a French diplomat that criticized the Adams administration. He died of yellow fever before his trial. James Callender, a Scottish-born journalist, was convicted for writing that President Adams was a hideous hermaphroditical character and that his administration was a reign of witches. He was sentenced to 9 months in jail and a fine of $200. This was the first great American free speech crisis, and it was resolved not in the Supreme Court, but at the ballot box. Thomas Jefferson defeated Adams in the election of 1800, a victory often called the Revolution of 1800. Jefferson, upon taking office, pardoned all those who had been convicted under the Sedition Act. He let the act expire. The crisis passed, but the question of what the First Amendment actually protected remained unsettled. The real modern legal definition of free speech in America was forged not in the quiet of the 18th century, but in the fire of the 20th. It was a time of war and panic. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, the Wilson administration pushed through Congress the Espionage Act, which made it a crime to interfere with military recruitment or to cause insubordination in the armed forces. The following year, the Sedition Act of 1918 extended the crackdown further, criminalizing any utterance deemed disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive toward the government, the military, the flag, or the Constitution itself. Eugene V. Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party and a four-time candidate for president, was arrested for giving a speech in Canton, Ohio, in which he criticized the war as a capitalist enterprise and praised those who had resisted the draft. The working class have never yet had a voice in declaring war, Debs said. You need to know that you are fit for something better than slavery and cannon fodder. He was convicted under the Espionage Act and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. He was 63 years old. He ran for president for the fifth time from his prison cell in Atlanta in 1920 and received nearly 1 million votes. He was pardoned by President Warren G. Harding in 1921. In 1919, the Supreme Court heard Schenck versus United States. Charles Schenck was the General Secretary of the Socialist Party in Philadelphia. He had distributed leaflets urging young men to resist the draft. The leaflet quoted the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, and argued that the draft was a violation of this principle. It urged readers to assert your rights. Schenck was convicted under the Espionage Act for obstructing recruitment. The great Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., a veteran of the Civil War who had been wounded 3 times in battle, wrote the opinion upholding the conviction. In it, he used a metaphor that would haunt free speech law for a generation. The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. That image, the crowded theater, has been used for 100 years to justify shutting people up. But Holmes, a man who had seen the horrors of war and the fragility of social order, was beginning to change his mind. He had been corresponding with a younger judge, learned hand, and with the political philosopher Harold Lasky, who were pushing him to consider a more robust protection for speech. Later that same year, in a dissent in Abrams versus United States, Holmes flipped the script. The case involved a group of Russian Jewish anarchists who had distributed leaflets criticizing American intervention in the Russian Revolution. They had called for a general strike to protest the sending of American troops to Russia. They were convicted under the Sedition Act and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Holmes, joined by Justice Louis Brandeis, dissented. He wrote one of the most stirring defenses of free thought in American jurisprudence. He argued that the goal of the Constitution is free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. He wrote, "But when men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may come to believe even more than they believe the very foundations of their own conduct, that the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which their wishes safely can be carried out. That, at any rate, is the theory of our Constitution." He argued that we should only punish speech when it poses a clear and present danger of imminent lawless action. The leaflets of the Abrams defendants, he wrote, were silly and posed no such danger. "Nobody can suppose," he wrote, "that the surreptitious publishing of a silly leaflet by an unknown man, without more, would present any immediate danger that its opinions would hinder the success of the government arms." This dissent is the intellectual foundation of modern First Amendment law. It introduced the idea that the government should not be in the business of deciding which ideas are true and which are false. The marketplace of ideas, not the censor's office, should be the arbiter of truth. It was a radical proposition, and it did not win the day immediately. For decades, the Supreme Court continued to uphold convictions for seditious speech, but the seed had been planted. The pendulum swung further under the leadership of Justice Louis Brandeis, who in the 1927 case Whitney v. California wrote a concurrence that reads like scripture for the First Amendment faithful. The case involved Charlotte Anita Whitney, a wealthy, elderly philanthropist and a member of the Communist Labor Party of California. She had attended a convention where the party adopted a platform that advocated for revolutionary change. She was convicted under California's Criminal Syndicalism Act. Brandeis, joined by Holmes, concurred in the judgment, but wrote a separate opinion that is a masterclass in the philosophy of free speech. Brandeis argued that the framers knew that fear breeds repression, that repression breeds hate, that hate menaces stable government, that the path of safety lies in the opportunity to discuss freely supposed grievances and proposed remedies, and that the fitting remedy for evil counsels is good ones. He wrote that the founders believed that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth, that without free speech and assembly discussion would be futile, that with them discussion affords ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine, that the greatest menace to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of the American government. His answer to bad speech was not silence, but more speech. If someone lies, you correct them. If someone preaches violence, you argue them down. You do not trust the government to be the censor. For Brandeis, the cure for bad speech is sunlight, not a muzzle. He added a crucial qualifier to the clear and present danger test. The danger must be so imminent and so serious that there is no time for discussion to correct the error. Only an emergency can justify repression, he wrote. Such must be the rule if authority is to be reconciled with freedom. This is the tradition we have inherited. It is a tradition that has been tested by a civil war, by 2 world wars, by the Red Scare of McCarthyism, where people lost their livelihoods for being accused of un-American thoughts, and by the civil rights movement. Indeed, the civil rights movement is perhaps the most powerful testament to why free speech matters for the powerless. Without the right to assemble in a church and sing "We Shall Overcome," without the right to print flyers calling for a boycott of segregated buses, without the right to stand at a lunch counter and ask to be served, the movement would have been crushed before it began. The freedom to speak is the first tool of the oppressed. Consider the case of the New York Times versus Sullivan in 1964. The case arose from a full-page advertisement placed in the Times by civil rights activists. The ad, titled "Heed Their Rising Voices," described the brutal treatment of peaceful protesters in the South. It contained several minor factual errors. For example, it said that students at Alabama State College had sung "My Country, 'Tis of Thee" on the steps of the state capitol, when in fact they had sung the national anthem. It said that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been arrested 7 times, when he had been arrested 4 times. The police commissioner of Montgomery, L.B. Sullivan, sued the Times for libel, claiming that the ad, though it did not name him, had defamed him by implication. An all-white jury in Alabama awarded Sullivan $500,000 in damages. The Supreme Court reversed the decision in a unanimous opinion written by Justice William Brennan. The court held that public officials cannot recover damages for defamation unless they can prove that the statement was made with actual malice, that is, with knowledge that it was false or with reckless disregard for whether it was false or not. This was a landmark decision. It constitutionalized the law of libel and created a zone of breathing space for criticism of public officials. Brennan wrote, "We consider this case against the background of a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open, and that it may well include vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks on government and public officials. The decision recognized that error is inevitable in free debate, and that if the state punished every factual mistake, the press would be chilled into silence. The Sullivan case is a direct descendant of the Areopagitica, of Holmes's dissent in Abrams, of Brandeis's concurrence in Whitney. It is the legal embodiment of the idea that the cure for bad speech is more speech, not a lawsuit. And now, here we are. We live in an age where anyone with a phone in their pocket can broadcast an idea to millions of people in a matter of seconds. The ancient Babylonians would have seen this as sorcery. The medieval inquisitors would have seen it as a portal to hell. The town square is now infinite, and it is very, very loud. This new reality has brought new challenges. The marketplace of ideas, which Holmes and Brandeis imagined as a deliberative forum of rational citizens, has become a global, instantaneous, and often vicious arena. Misinformation spreads faster than truth. Algorithms designed to maximize engagement amplify outrage and division. Anonymous mobs can destroy a person's reputation in hours. The old legal frameworks, built for a world of newspapers and broadcast licenses, are straining to keep up. Yet the fundamental questions remain the same. Who decides what is true? Who decides what is dangerous? Who decides what is hateful? If we give the government the power to silence speech it deems false or harmful, who will stop them from silencing the speech we hold dear? The history of free speech is a history of power trying to silence its critics. It is the history of kings and popes and presidents and algorithms all reaching for the mute button. And it is the history of individuals, prophets, philosophers, poets, printers, and protesters who refused to be silenced. This brings us back to that initial moment in the crowded marketplace. We are all standing in that marketplace now, all the time. The history of free speech shows us that the instinct to silence the other side is as old as human society. It is the default setting of power. The invention of tolerance, the protection of dissent, the belief that a bad idea is better fought with a better idea than with a prison cell, these are the historical anomalies. They are the hard-won, fragile, and often unpopular victories of a long, bloody, and unfinished struggle. The story does not end with a tidy rule from a judge or a perfectly phrased tweet. It ends with the recognition that the hand clamping down on the shoulder in that ancient crowd is not just the hand of a tyrant or a priest. It is sometimes our own hand, reaching for the mute button on someone whose voice we find inconvenient, ignorant, or offensive. The history of free speech is not just the history of the loudest voices winning. It is the history of protecting the quietest voices, the strangest voices, and even the wrong voices. Because the moment we decide that this particular idea is too dangerous to be heard is the moment we forget what Socrates taught us in that Athenian jail cell. The unexamined life is not worth living, and an unexamined society, a society that cannot speak its mind, is not a society at all. It is just a quiet room, waiting for orders. And history has given us a very clear warning about what happens when the room gets too quiet. The history of free speech is not a story of steady, inevitable progress. It is a story of cycles. Periods of openness are followed by periods of repression. The rights we take for granted can be taken away. They have been taken away before. In the 1790s, the Alien and Sedition Acts showed how quickly a young republic could turn on its own principles in a time of perceived crisis. In the 1910s and 1920s, the Espionage Act and the Red Scare showed how war and fear could justify the imprisonment of dissenters. In the 1950s, McCarthyism showed how the mere accusation of unorthodox belief could destroy careers and lives without a single criminal conviction. And yet, each of these periods of repression was followed by a period of reaction and reclamation. The election of 1800 repudiated the Sedition Act. The dissents of Holmes and Brandeis in the 1920s laid the groundwork for the free speech revolution of the 1960s. The courage of journalists like Edward R. Murrow, who used his platform on CBS to expose the bullying and dishonesty of Senator Joseph McCarthy, helped turn the tide against the Red Scare. Murrow's broadcast on March 9, 1954, in which he said of McCarthy, "We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty," and "We will not walk in fear one of another," was a turning point in public opinion. It was an act of free speech that helped restore the conditions for more free speech. The lesson is that free speech is not self-executing. It requires constant vigilance, constant argument, and constant courage. It requires us to defend the right of those we despise to speak, not because we agree with them, but because the principle that protects them is the same principle that protects us. If the government can silence the neo-Nazi, it can silence the civil rights activist. If the mob can deplatform the controversial professor, it can deplatform the whistleblower. The line between dangerous speech and dissent we need is drawn by those in power, and history shows that they rarely draw it in a way that favors the powerless. We must also reckon with the limits of the metaphor of the marketplace of ideas. Markets can be manipulated. They can be flooded with cheap, low-quality goods that drive out the valuable ones. They can be dominated by monopolies that drown out smaller voices. The digital public square is not a level playing field. It is shaped by algorithms that prioritize engagement over accuracy, by business models that reward outrage over reflection, and by foreign actors who seek to sow discord and undermine trust. The challenge of our time is not just to protect the legal right to speak, but to cultivate the cultural conditions in which speech can be meaningful, in which truth can emerge from the cacophony, in which we can hear one another across the chasms of our differences. This is not a legal problem alone, it is a human problem. It is a problem of attention, of patience, of humility, and of courage. It requires us to listen as well as to speak. It requires us to be willing to be wrong, to change our minds, to admit that we do not have all the answers. The Socratic method is not just a way of asking questions, it is a way of being in the world. It is the recognition that wisdom begins with the acknowledgement of our own ignorance. I know that I know nothing, Socrates said. This is not a statement of despair, it is an invitation to inquiry. It is the starting point of all genuine conversation. So where does this leave us? We are the inheritors of a long, bloody, and unfinished tradition. We carry in our legal documents and our cultural memory the echoes of Hammurabi's stele, of Socrates' hemlock, of Cicero's severed hands, of Wycliffe's scattered ashes, of Luther's defiant stand, of Milton's eloquent plea, of Holmes's and Brandeis's wise dissents, of the marchers in Selma singing their freedom songs. We are the beneficiaries of their courage and their stubbornness. We owe them a debt that can only be repaid by continuing their work. The next time you hesitate before speaking, the next time you feel that hand on your shoulder warning you to be quiet, remember that you are not alone. You are part of a conversation that has been going on for 4,000 years. You are standing in a marketplace that stretches from the ziggurats of Babylon to the servers of Silicon Valley. The words you speak, the words you write, the words you choose not to speak, all of them are contributions to this ancient and ongoing argument about what it means to be human and to live together in a world of difference. Free speech is not a guarantee of harmony. It is often the opposite. It is a guarantee of conflict, of argument, of discomfort. But it is also the only mechanism we have ever devised that allows us to resolve our conflicts without violence, to argue instead of fight, to persuade instead of coerce. It is the fragile, imperfect, and indispensable foundation of any society that aspires to be both free and just. The marketplace is crowded, the voices are many, the noise is deafening, but the alternative is silence. And silence, as history teaches us, is the sound of a society preparing to die. So speak, listen, argue, change your mind, stand your ground. But whatever you do, do not let the room get too quiet. The conversation is the only thing standing between us and the darkness, and it is a conversation that must never, ever end. Thank you for listening all the way through. This was The History of Free Speech, brought to you by Steve Buttercup III. If this was worth your time, a like and a subscribe go a long way. And if you have thoughts on the story, or if something stood out, let me know in the comments. I've begun growing a library of more audiobooks like this to be released on Spotify over the next few months. You can listen there for free if you're a Spotify Premium member, otherwise the paid support is appreciated. If you're interested in dark history, power, unsettling questions, doomed figures, and uncomfortable historical parallels, find my X or Twitter page. Thank you for listening.